In late 2025 and into 2026, Washington, D.C. basically turned the lights off on itself. And it happened twice. This isn't just some political drama. It's about what happens when the most powerful government on Earth actually runs out of cash. So let's break down exactly how it all went down.
Seriously, think about that question. It's not just a hypothetical. When the US government shuts down, it impacts millions of people in very real ways. So to get how this happened, we need to pop the hood and look at the gears of government and, well, the political fault lines that we're just waiting to crack.
You know, the 2024 election set up what was basically a political tightrope. One party was technically in charge, but their grip was, let's just say, not very firm. It created this high-wire act where just one little wobble could send the whole government crashing down.
Okay, so think of the entire federal government as this huge, complex machine. To keep it running, it needs fuel. And that fuel, it comes in the form of 12 massive spending bills called appropriations bills. Congress has to pass all of them by October 1st every year. If they don't, the engine just stops.
Now, if you just glanced at this, you might think, okay, one party controls everything, should be easy, right? But when you dig into the numbers, you see the real story. A 5-seat margin in the House, only 6 in the Senate, that's not a mandate. That is a minefield. It means just a handful of lawmakers can dig in their heels and bring the whole process to a halt. And in the Senate, there's a special rule that makes those numbers even more fragile.
Everything, and I mean everything, comes down to this number 60. With only 53 seats, the Republicans couldn't pass a funding bill on their own. They absolutely needed to get some Democrats on board to break what's called a filibuster. This single number is the reason compromise is so critical, and it's the very reason everything fell apart when that compromise failed.
All right, so with that stage set, the first act of this whole drama kicked off in the fall of 2025. That big October 1st deadline was getting closer and closer, and you could just see the battle lines being drawn in the sand.
And look, this wasn't just some small disagreement over how long to keep the lights on. The two competing plans showed a massive gap in ideology. We're talking about the future of healthcare, how to protect lawmakers. These are really fundamental disagreements about which direction the country should go.
That last week of September, it was just a whirlwind of political chaos. Every time they tried to make a deal, it hit a brick wall. Votes failed, meetings were canceled out of the blue, and all the while the clock was just ticking down. You can see it right here, the dominoes just falling, one by one, right toward that inevitable shutdown.
And then, this happened. The door to negotiation wasn't just closed, it was slammed shut. This post from the president wasn't just some political jab. It was the moment high-level talks completely broke down. With only a week to go, a shutdown went from being a real possibility to pretty much a certainty.
And just like that, at the stroke of midnight, the deadline came and went. There was no agreement, and the federal government officially shut down. So, after more than a month of the government being shut down, a little glimmer of hope finally appeared. But let's be clear, this wasn't a peace treaty. It was more like a temporary ceasefire. Let's look at the incredibly fragile deal that put a pause on the stalemate.
This was a classic Washington compromise, which really means they solved a few of the easier problems and just pushed the biggest fights down the road. So yeah, some important departments like Veterans Affairs and Agriculture got their funding for the whole year, but the main event, that was just postponed until January. For federal workers, though, this was a huge lifeline. It guaranteed they'd get their jobs back and receive back pay.
This vote count right here tells you the entire story. The deal passed by a single vote, 60, the absolute bare minimum they needed. It took a small group of 8 senators crossing party lines to pull the government back from the brink. This was not some big bipartisan consensus. This was a deal hanging on by a thread.
But, truces don't last forever. That temporary fix was really just a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound. As soon as the calendar flipped to 2026, the second shutdown was already looming on the horizon.
Remember how that temporary deal kicked the can down the road? Well, it was time to deal with what was inside that can. And the new flashpoint was the Department of Homeland Security, the very agency that handles some of the most heated and controversial issues in the country.
Things then took a tragic turn after Alex Preddy was killed by CBP agents. That event sent shockwaves through the negotiations, and Senate Democrats announced they could no longer support the funding bill for DHS. This led to a frantic, last-minute scramble that ended up funding the rest of the government, but left Homeland Security with just a tiny 2-week extension to figure things out.
But even that desperate short-term patch wasn't enough.
The Senate managed to pass the deal, but then the House just stopped. They announced they wouldn't vote until the following week. Since the deadline was January 31st, a Saturday, doing the math meant a partial shutdown was now completely unavoidable.
So after all this political back and forth, what does it actually mean for you, for your family, for your community? This is the part where the story moves out of the halls of Congress and starts to affect the lives of everyday people.
First, it's really important to get this. This was a partial shutdown, so some parts of the government, like the VA and agriculture, were already funded for the year, and they kept running as usual. But as you can see, some of the biggest, most critical departments, their lights were out.
And the consequences were felt almost immediately. If you went to an airport, the TSA officers and air traffic controllers were there, but they were working without pay. Same goes for lots of essential federal employees and military members. Other workers were just told to stay home, furloughed, their paychecks frozen. And if you were trying to start a small business, your loan application just sat there, indefinitely on hold.
Okay, so amid all that chaos, there was some good news. Some of the most essential services were protected. Post offices stayed open, so mail kept coming. Social Security and Medicare checks still went out, though if you were a new applicant, you could expect delays. And really vital food assistance programs were expected to continue on time.
And this really gets to the heart of the impossible choices that a shutdown forces on people. At the Department of Education, they made sure that student aid payments, something millions of people rely on, went out on time. But to do that, they had to stop all of their civil rights investigations. It's just a really stark reminder of the hidden costs of this kind of political gridlock.
So here's the bottom line. Even when it's just a partial shutdown, it sends these huge shockwaves across the country. Critical services get disrupted or just plain stopped, and hundreds of thousands of American families are left in financial limbo, with no idea when their next paycheck is coming.
And that leaves us with one final and pretty sobering question. When the most basic function of government, just funding itself, becomes a predictable, recurring crisis, what's the real cost? Forget the missed paychecks and the delayed services for a second. What is the long-term damage to the country when we govern by lurching from one self-inflicted crisis to the